Hej och varmt välkomna till Global Gains-podden. Idag ska vi prata om den multipolära världen med ingen mindre än Mårten Springborg från SEO Worldwide. Jag heter Karl Lans och vid min sida sitter min kollega
Per Ståhl.
Men först så ska vi nämna att det här avsnittet presenteras i samarbete med Montrose, som ju är en svensk plattform som är skräddarsydd för professionella och avancerade investerare som kräver lite mer.
Ja, och de är också årets utmanare 2025 av Privata Affärer blir de utsedda till. Och den senaste nyheten, jag pratade ju precis med Niklas faktiskt, det är att för alla utdelningsjägare då, om man är sån och har en lång utdelningshistorik i sin portfölj, så går det alldeles utmärkt att byta till Montrose för att man kan importera all utdelningshistorik bland annat, och det kan ju vara viktigt om man jobbar mycket med utdelningar då, att det är en viktig del av sin investeringsstrategi. Och kundsupporten är öppen till 22.00 på kvällen. Man får faktiskt en personlig kontaktman också om man är Platinum-kund. Och för att bli Platinum-kund så ska man ha minst 5 miljoner kronor hos Montrose.
Ja, och om ni vill testa Montrose, då ska ni gå in och öppna ett konto och uppge koden Global Gains. Och det är ihopskrivet och med små bokstäver. Och glöm inte att investeringar innebär en risk.
Ja, absolut. Och det ska vi lära oss mer om idag med dagens talare, eller dagens gäst, med Mårten. Mårten, welcome to Global Gains.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to your pod.
Very nice to have you here. We have had quite a dramatic world the last few months. What's your view at the moment?
I am actually quite surprised that equity markets are at all-time highs. Looking at the US equity market, I believe yesterday they went to all-time highs. I understand that the earnings growth in the underlying equities in the US is strong, but I think what is happening in the Gulf is a significant event that I think that we have not fully yet seen the effects of. But maybe my starting point would be that for the last 1.5 years, I believed that the US equity markets have reached a peak in its relative valuation to world equity markets. That peak was on Christmas Eve 2024 at 67% of global equities. And my view is it's going to go down relative to the rest of the world. Cyclically relative to Europe and structurally to Asia and emerging markets.
How much will it go down, do you think?
I think it would not be unexpected if 67% was reduced to perhaps 50% over a 5 to 10 year period. And that means that if you are a global equity investor, you need to underweight investments in the US. I have published reports on that, and I don't think that's the drivers of that is something that we're going to discuss today. But I think what is happening in the Gulf right now is an accelerator for this movement of capital out of the US. Right now, we are seeing that the dollar is strengthening because of the rising tensions in global geopolitics. But I think that is just a short-term effect. I think the longer-term effects are going to be less capital inflows into the US, especially because if you see who is being negatively affected by the shutdowns of energy exports out of the Middle East, it is typically surplus countries that have invested their surplus capital in US capital markets, especially in US equity markets over the last 10-15 years. Talk about Japan, Korea, the Middle East, Gulf countries. All of these countries here now have a significant liquidity squeeze because of rising commodity prices, because of rising energy prices, food prices, fertilizer prices, and all that stuff, of which we have not seen the effects of yet. That is something that we will see in the months to come. And I think the effects of that is that capital will, to a less degree, flow into the US compared to what it has done historically.
How do you think that will play out? What will it affect? Will the interest rates rise, and will the stock market go down as well? Will it be like they will not invest in either interest rate products and equities?
Well, the US is the largest net debt nation in the world. The net international investment position of the US is minus $27 trillion, which is approximately 85-90% of US GDP. 20 years ago, it was almost zero. So the last 20 years have been a period where, because of very, very significant overconsumption and very, very large both public sector deficits and also current account deficits. A lot of capital have been sucked into the US economy in order to finance that. And a lot of that has come from the countries I mentioned to you, and I would just mention one of them, and that is Japan, which is the largest net creditor nation in the world. Their net creditor position is 60% of Japanese GDP. They have, for the last, I would say, almost 30 years, been manipulating interest rates very low because they were fighting a deflationary bust. And because of that very low interest rate environment in Japan, Japanese institutional investors, but also private individuals, have exported capital out of Japan in order to get a better return than what they could get in Japan. Now, for the last couple of years, Japan has suddenly managed to create inflation. So now we have inflation of 3% in Japan, and interest rates will be going up in Japan. I think short-term interest rates is 0.75% in Japan with an interest rate of 3%. Highly, highly negative, really, short-term interest rates. And we've seen that the long interest rates in Japan are also moving up.
Is that a problem? I mean, they have quite a big net debt anyway, even if they are a big creditor.
Yeah, that is not something that I worry too much about. I think at least until interest rate movements becomes too violent, I don't think that's an issue we should consider. Instead, what we should consider is the effects on the rest of the world of Japan potentially pulling back capital from external markets. Because all other things equal, that will lead to a pressure upwards on interest rates in the rest of the world as Japan repatriates capital. But time will tell. In the meantime, what is happening now in the Middle East, for me, it is very, very unexpected. And I also saw that right after the war broke out, there was a JP Morgan strategist who said that this here was not the worst case scenario that they could consider, but it was the completely unthinkable nightmare scenario that happened. It's very difficult to understand the motives of why Trump and the American administration went along with Israel and attacked Iran. Because I think that the US today is now in a position that is very, very uncomfortable, and where Trump does not control the situation. He cannot tackle. Trump always chickens out. That is not a situation for him, because in order to tackle, you need to have two persons or two to do it. And the other here is, of course, Iran. And I think actually Iran now sees this as a situation where they can change the geopolitical position that Iran has been in for the last 50 years or 40 years, this isolation that the country has been in since the mullahs took over in 1979, because they have a control now on the global economy. If you look at the co-movements in oil prices and long-term interest rates, they are highly, highly positive. That means as oil prices goes up, so does the long end of the bond market, especially in the US. And if there's one thing that we in the West cannot really manage, is much higher longer-term interest rates. And therefore, Trump has to get the oil price down. He needs to open the Hormuz Strait. And the longer that this is prolonged, the closure of the Hormuz Strait, of course, the more dire the consequences on global energy markets are going to be. Now, what the Iranians are now also saying is that in order to facilitate transportation through the Hormuz Strait, they would want to be able to, of course, charge a fee for passage. And that fee should be paid not in dollars, but either in Bitcoin or in Chinese currencies, renminbi. And eventually they also are demanding that energy markets in the Gulf transitions away from dollar. And that is a really, really vital attack on the petrodollar standard that has been operating since 1974. So I think this is part of the bigger story I started out with, that we are going to see the US equity market weighting in global equities going down. And one of the drivers is that the value of the dollar is going to go down. The dollar is very expensive compared to history. And one of the drivers that's going to make the dollar less expensive is going to be that a lower share of global energy markets are going to be traded in dollars, and there's going to be a transition towards multi-currency trading in global energy markets. That is going to be positive for the valuation of renminbi, and it's probably also going to be positive for the euro, in that European nations will be put in a situation where we can actually buy our energy, not necessarily in dollars, but in euros. I think that longer term, this is good for the US, because the US also needs a lower value of the dollar in order to do what they want in the US, namely move manufacturing capacities back to the US. That is not something that will happen with a very expensive dollar. So the dollar needs to devalue, and I think that's going to happen over the next 5 years. And what is happening in the Gulf right now is an accelerant to that story.
What countries do you prefer to invest in instead? If you have a certain amount invested in US, you need to invest it somewhere.
Well, we like Europe, at least from a cyclical point of view, because we think that we are in a period where we are going to see much, much higher investments in physical infrastructure, whether that is electrification, in energy, in defense. We have underinvested in those end markets the last 20 to 40 years. We have been very, very enthusiastic about digitization, software, and all that stuff, and that is also critical for the world economy, but we have underinvested in the physical structures beneath our technology, and that has to be recreated. And in Europe, we have a lot of companies that are focused on that are world-class. So we have good exposure to European engineering companies. Sweden, of course, is one example of a country where you can find good companies in engineering. But Germany, Italy, France also comes up very positively here. More structurally, I would say that we have, for the last 15 years, been in a bear market for emerging markets. And we could talk an hour about that. We don't have time for that. But I would say one of the drivers of the underperformance of emerging markets in general have been the strength of the US dollar. The dollar has been very strong since the financial crisis. And typically when the dollar is strong, capital flows to the US and out of minor markets like emerging markets. Now, we have seen a peak in the dollar. We have, for the last little bit more than a year, seen that the US equity markets have underperformed relative to most other markets, especially emerging markets. And I think that we are at one of these structural turning points where we could actually imagine that the next 10, 15, 20 years is going to see strong emerging market outperformance relative to the US. So while I'm cyclically optimistic about Europe, I am structurally optimistic, much longer term optimistic about emerging markets. And one of the drivers here is also that I believe actually currencies are going to be more important. You're going to get a component of your total return is going to come from appreciating currencies in emerging markets, primarily in Asia, because the Asian currency bloc centered around the Chinese renminbi is extremely lowly valued today. And now most strategists would agree with me that it is likely that the renminbi will appreciate 2 to 4% a year. And actually, since the war broke out, the renminbi is up 7% vis-a-vis the dollar. That is a new development. But I think actually the potential currency appreciation in Asia is much, much bigger. And it has to do with the underlying competitive dynamics of these economies. And I'll just give you a few examples of why I believe that we could see a massive appreciation of the renminbi over the next 10 years. In China, today, they construct nuclear power plants at a cost of 1/5 the cost in the West. That means that longer term, that will be capitalized into the total cost of electricity in China relative to the rest of the world, where China is going to have electricity cost that is going to be much, much lower. And electricity is the base cost of an economy. Economic growth is energy transformed. So unless that relative cost advantage disappears, there's no way that we will be able to actually move manufacturing back to the world and become competitive with China. So I could see that the renminbi would go up 4 or 5 times Yeah, it's actually in order to compensate for that. And another way to look at it is that Tesla produces Tesla cars both in California and in Shanghai.
And in Germany.
And in Germany, for that
With
matter.
the highest energy prices in the world.
Yeah, and I don't have the cost numbers for Germany, but I can tell you that in California, the salary of a worker is $88,000 plus $22,000 for healthcare. In Shanghai, the price is $22,000. There are the same number of employees in the Shanghai and in the California Fairmont plant. But Shanghai produces twice as many cars, which means that the Shanghai labor cost is 1/10 the price in California. And finally, if you go to Shanghai, you can stay at Four Seasons Hotel for something between $150 and $200. In the US, it costs 10 times as much. So you can see on different types of cost comparisons, China is so much cheaper. And the only way I see that we can actually neutralize that is via currency revaluations, which means that I think that the Asian bloc, because all the other Asian currencies trades very closely aligned with the Chinese renminbi, that currency bloc is going to go up massively over the next 10, 15 years.
What's the best way to take advantage of this? How do you invest in this scenario, so to speak?
Well,
in China or...
We have recently bought direct equity exposure in China. We bought a company called CATL, CATL. It's the world's largest battery manufacturer. Yeah. They just reported yesterday. It's been a massive outperformer since we bought it. And yesterday, I think, was up 11% on the result. 5 years ago, you could say that the technology race in batteries was undecided. We did not know who's going to be the technology winner. You had Panasonic, and then you had the Chinese. And the Swedes, for that matter, yeah. But you never really got out of the starting block. 5 years ago, the companies that drove demand for batteries was typically the luxury car manufacturers in Europe. Let's take a BMW. If you were to convince a buyer of a BMW that he should transition from a combustion technology to an electric vehicle, the battery had to be state-of-the-art, very high power density. And that was typically a combination of nickel and cobalt in the battery. And that's an expensive battery. But it was also the best power density back then. Now, the Chinese could not afford that because in contrast to BMW, which has a very expensive car and therefore can afford to put an expensive battery into it, the Chinese car manufacturers were selling value cars, cheap cars in China primarily. And therefore they had to focus on a battery technology that was much, much less expensive. And that was phosphate-based technology. And cost much, much less, but also had lower density of power. It was an inferior battery. But basically today what has happened is that 85% of Chinese batteries today are LFP, as it is called. And it's not nickel cobalt. And because the Chinese auto manufacturers are now going global, and they are basically killing Western auto manufacturers in export markets, in order to be competitive, BMW has also to go LFP, buying the batteries from China. So today you have two very large Chinese battery manufacturers. You have CATL, which is the dominant Chinese manufacturer, and today has a 42% global market share. And number two is BYD, which is a vertically integrated car company that also produces its batteries. The demand for batteries is going up like 50% per annum. That is the growth rate that CATL right now is reporting. And they are guiding for something like 30% growth out till 2040. And they are approaching 50% of global market share in batteries. An end market that's going to go from between 1 and 2 terawatt hours of demand last year up to 15 terawatt hours of demand by 2050. It's a market that will grow 10% over a few decades, and where you're going to see CATL and other Chinese manufacturers taking a disproportionate large share of that growth. So that's an example of something that in Asia that we have bought recently. that we believe is interesting. China, you should be a little bit careful because China is not all positive. The manufacturing competitiveness of China is unbelievable. The growth in exports out of China is 22% year over year right now in a world economy that is really not growing that strongly. But the problem in China is domestic demand. The domestic demand is very weak. The Chinese consumer is very weak because house prices has gone down a lot, and therefore people have lost a big share of their total savings, and the consumer sentiment is really dire. That has to change to a more positive domestic environment before we say it's all go for China. But so far, our focus when we talk about our global strategy is that we focus on Chinese manufacturing excellence.
What else do you find in China that's interesting except the batteries?
What is interesting is also that China has, at least since 2018, when Donald Trump started his technology war against China by banning exports of advanced semiconductor machinery to China. China has been focused on becoming self-sufficient in technology across the board. We think that it is likely that China is going to be self-sufficient even in the most difficult sector to become that, and that is in advanced semiconductor manufacturing technologies. Like we have an investment in ASML, a Dutch company that produces lithography machines that basically has made it possible to extend the so-called Moore's law because it can manufacture at extremely small nodes. And everybody has said that it's going to be very, very difficult for China to compete against that technology for the next 10 to 15, 20 years. I have a couple of colleagues who came back from China recently with the view that China by 2030 most likely is going to be closing that technology gap with Western technology. And you can say that is the flip side of the Donald Trump's strategy to contain Chinese technological advancement, that instead of selling NVIDIA chips to China and allowing Western companies to prosper from the demand in China, we have now created a situation where, because of banning the exports of NVIDIA chips, China has been forced to develop them themselves. It has set them back a few years, but it is highly likely that China, because of that policy, will become even more independent technologically. There is an Australian technology institute called ASPI that makes a survey every year on what countries are leading in 60. They measure across 64 different technology verticals. It spans from radar technology to nuclear fission and fusion and AI, material sciences across the board. And 20 years ago, China was leading in 3, and the US was leading in 57. Now it is reversed, and China is a leader in 57 and the US in 3. And the only thing that the US still can be considered to be a leader in is in AI. But also there, we believe that China is closing the gap. So what we're looking into is that we have kind of been living the last centuries with a situation where a very small population center in the West have been the largest economies in the world. And that is what is changing right now. You have 1.4 billion people in China that historically have been not very productive, but certainly are seeing tremendous technological advancement domestically, driving much bigger manufacturing footprint and exporting to the rest of the world. And that is going to recalibrate the world economy, and the economic growth is of course going to migrate towards Asia relative to where it has been for the last few hundred years. It is happening as we speak, and I think that it is going to also be reflected in equity market weightings, because it is also going to migrate away from the West. We have to remember, for example, that I think European population is only 4% of the world's population. That longer term will also be reflected in economic output, that we will shrink relative to the rest of the world. It's not necessarily a negative, but we have to accept the fact that that will also, if you're an investor, you have to put that into your perspective of where you want to allocate your investments.
Some people say that Europe is going to turn into a nice museum in the long run. But that's probably the negative view of it. But
I hope that if we, for example, take generative AI as an example, there are two clear centers of technological acceleration here. You have the US and you have the China ecosystem. And then you have Europe that is basically not existent. We are not participating, more or less. We have one or two players, but they are subscale. What I hope that we will see is that, of course, that as we move away from developing these systems to start using them, that European enterprises will be able to drive productivity improvements from the use of AI. And that AI is just going to be like any other input into the manufacturing process, just like electricity, for example. Like that is taking the longer-term view. I am not necessarily negative on Europe. I think that we have some very, very important competences in what is required for the world. But we also need to really get ourselves together, to say it like it is, and instead of trying to build bureaucracy, try to create a basis for entrepreneurship in Europe that is not existing today. And I think that the politicians in Europe completely gets it today because of the electroshock that we have gotten from the combination of war on our eastern border and the withdrawal of support defense-wise from the US.
Yeah, so you even see now that in Germany they have changed their mind on nuclear energy, for instance, and also in Denmark.
Yes, well, not yet, but I think there's a population majority now in Europe. In Denmark is also in favor of nuclear. We just have to get the politicians around to it. And the problem for politicians is, of course, to go out and say something that is completely opposite to what they've said historically. That is a very, very difficult thing for a politician. Despite the fact that it makes sense to change your mind. And I think that is something that we probably have talked about previously in these podcasts, that energy is so vital. And we have to understand that China today has the lowest cost of capital in the world. They have the most competitive labor force in the world. And they have the lowest cost of energy in the world. If we want to compete, we got to lift our productivity enormously, and we got to lower the cost disadvantage we have on energy in Europe. I hope that the politicians understand it. But that is why I'm not structurally optimistic about Europe. I'm cyclically optimistic about Europe because I think what is happening now in, for example, defense spending is going to have a significant multiplicator positive effects in the economy. Europe has been very, very stringent when it comes to fiscal policy for 15 years. It is quite unbelievable, but trust me when I tell you the US has had on average 6.6% fiscal deficits since the financial crisis. For more than 15 years, on average, 6.6% public sector deficit. Now, there's something called the Kalecki profit equation, that it's an identity, and it states what drives profitability of companies in an economy. And one of the inputs in that identity is the size of the public sector deficit. So the larger the deficit in an economy, the larger the liquidity injection into the economy, and the higher profitability for companies exposed to that economy. So, to a large extent, the outperformance of American companies' earnings over the last 15 years has been driven by very large public sector deficits, injecting liquidity into the economy. In Europe, we have been very focused on having zero budget deficits, which have really reduced liquidity in our economies. And I think what has happened since Germany turned around and have removed the constitutional requirements for a balanced budget is that we will see significant fiscal deficits in Europe in order to catch up on our defense and infrastructure investments, where we have underinvested for the last, I don't know how many years. That's going to be very positive for companies that are direct recipients of those liquidity injections. And it's going to be broader positive for the economy as such. And I think actually we can start to think that European growth rates will go up because of this.
I think that's a very good point. If you look at Poland, for instance, they are 2-3 years ahead of Germany. They have a bigger deficit, and the stock market is one of the best for a couple of years, and they are spending a lot.
Yes. Of course, we also have to consider that there are very, very big public sector debt issues in certain European countries. It's not in Sweden, it's not in Denmark, it's not in Germany, it's not in Poland, but it is in France, first and foremost. And it is in the Mediterranean countries. And therefore, when you think about how to allocate in Europe, I think actually the country factor is important. So when you buy a defense company in Europe, you have to think about what is the country that is the largest customer of that company. We have, last year we bought Rheinmetall in our strategy. And the reason is obviously that defense spendings are going up. But it is also because we believe that the German customer for Rheinmetall is a better customer than the French or the Italian state would be for a French or an Italian defense company.
One is kind of new topic. I mean, we have we have lots of car factories in Europe, and they are not running at 100%. Because of the Chinese competition and so on. We have seen some news that Volkswagen thinking about to converting one of the plants to robotics. And I saw a news flash yesterday that Trump is talking with the big car manufacturers in US because they don't have they have spare capacity to convert it into defense companies and things like that. Do you think that could be a new trend that would benefit Europe, because we have lots of factories that are not really, we will not use the maximum out of it?
I think that we are increasingly realizing in Europe that we are in an existential crisis. The business model of Europe has been turned upside down. We used to get cheap energy from Russia. We used to get our defense from the US, and we used to export our products to China. Everything has broken down. And this happens. So now we realize that we need to invest and invest and invest in defense, in infrastructure, in energy markets. And that happens exactly at a point where demographic changes are accelerating in Europe. We have very, very aging economies, and we have labor markets that are shrinking. And all other things equal, that would mean that if we invest into an economy where you have a shrinking labor market, you would see significant inflationary pressures in the economy. Therefore, I actually think that what is happening to the European car industry could also be seen as a positive thing, because it makes it possible for us to move scarce resources away from an industry that clearly is a sunset industry. European auto manufacturers, I would say, is not where you want to allocate your capital. It's a dying industry. Not because the end product is necessarily going away, but because of the competitive pressures that is coming from China. It's very, very difficult for Europe to compete. So what we have seen is that Rheinmetall, for example, have been interested in taking over capacity from Volkswagen. So I can see that resource reallocation internally in Europe is a positive thing. We need to develop industries for the future. And I don't believe the auto industry is an industry for the future in Europe. There's a lot of capacity, capital and labor tied up in that industry that we could use for a better purpose in other sectors. The same thing goes if you, from a macroeconomic point of view, think about it. Like we have been exporting to the US. I think, forgive me if I'm not completely precise, but let's say we have an export surplus of 300 billion euros per annum, something like that, to the US, into an economy that is over-consuming. What is the utilization for Europe of exporting our capacities to the US, especially now when you can say that geopolitical relationships between the European Union and US is breaking down? Instead, we should, I think, take this as an opportunity and say that we do an internal reallocation of our resources in Europe and allocate it to areas where we can actually improve our geopolitical position longer term. And that means that we have to invest much, much more in our energy markets in Europe. We have to deepen our automation in our manufacturing in order to be more competitive. And we need to invest in future industries. Whether it is in bio, in pharma, or it's in quantum, or it's in fusion, nuclear, areas for future growth, and where we still have the possibility of actually building a position that can be world leading.
Thank you, Morten, for your insights. It has been a pleasure to have the discussion with you about the world and what's going on. What do you say, Carl?
Yeah, very interesting to listen to you as always, Morten. And thank you very much for coming to us.
Vi tackar alla som har lyssnat, och innan ni lägger på så glöm inte bort, gå in på Montrose och anmäl er med Global Gains, ett ord, små bokstäver. Tack för idag.
Vi vill påminna om att allt som diskuteras i denna podcast är gästernas och våra egna åsikter. Ingen del av samtalet ska betraktas som investeringsråd. Gör alltid din egen analys eller rådgör med en kvalificerad finansiell rådgivare innan du tar investeringsbeslut.